Call to order the meeting, the informational meeting of the Sioux Falls City Council. Today is May 29th, 2012. Welcome to everyone in the Carnegie Town Hall and those of you watching on Channel 16 and on our CityLink SiouxFalls.org. We shall open with staff report from Lori Hogstead, City Clerk.
Thank you, Council Chair Erpenbach and City Council members. Just a couple quick items. Alpha Video finished just about finished their punch list in our council chambers last week. They were here 4 days and into the evening. There's a few things that they still need to work on. We're going to have a timer installation that will be up on the area behind the podium. They're also doing some fine tuning with the DVD player and then also working on the audio recording equipment, which a couple of the committees use, such as the Board of Adjustment. So just a few things to finish up, and then I don't know if you've noticed, but in the corner of the room back there, there's a portable lectern that is on wheels that can be moved, and a microphone will be installed on that. There's a light on it, a timer, and that can be used for various presentations that we may need in this building, and it matches really nice with our woodwork. And we will just keep that in that corner of the room, and we'll be able to wheel it wherever we may need it. So that will be a nice addition to this room as well. And that is the end of my report.
Great, thank you. Questions for Lori? I have one question for you, Lori. Talk about that. I didn't realize that was part of the project, this movable lectern. Have you thought of, like if we have meetings in the overflow room, is that someplace that we might use that?
What? That would probably work really well because there will be a microphone on it, and it will project the voices a little bit better. It's easy to move. I went back this morning and moved it around a little bit, and I would think we certainly could use it for the overflow room.
Okay. Then one other question, talk a little bit about the timer. I know that's been a concern for public input during the 7 o'clock meetings. Can you,
right.
Where will it be? What will it look like for folks?
There's going to be a timer in it, and the audience will not see it, nor will the speaker, but it will be seen from this area. I know there was talk of possibly having 2 timers, one that the speaker could see and possibly the audience. And the Alpha Video Company has said in their experience with these timers that it doesn't always work well to have it visible to the audience because people might start, commenting, well, your 5 minutes are up and you're still talking and that person got 5 minutes and 10 seconds, so on. So from what I understand, it's just going to be installed, right on the platform there so that it's viewable from this side. And I guess we can talk about if we want to have any kind of a countdown system or a light system. But we should be able to see it. It won't be real large. I know there were different sizes that were looked at, but it will be readable and viewable from here.
Okay, good. That keeps that timing in the hands of the presiding officer and keeps things under control for us. So I appreciate that update. Anything else for Lori? Any questions for Lori? Yeah, I think it's going to be a good thing. Thank you, Councilor Relton. Okay, City Council open discussion. Councilor Jameson.
Thank you. Councilor Karski and myself have been working on the revisions to charter or the ordinance 1304. That's that one we've been talking about, how to deal with the capital improvement program, and then as well the recommendations from somebody on how we can spend this $4 million in the future if we should have another $4 million. We're working on the final details, and we're going to be sending it off to the city attorney for his opinions and review of the language. Our intention, as you remember, was to get it on the agenda and through the council as fast as we could so that we could include this process in the current budget cycle. Just a couple other details that come out of it, just so you know what we're working on. Essentially, it's going to define who would be on the Capital Improvement Program Committee and essentially who would be in charge then and chair that committee. How it works would be defined within that ordinance revision. It's also a part that would recommend potential projects for us to consider early on in the budget cycle so that hopefully by this time next year we will have already had our recommendations from this committee on what we should be doing and where we should be spending our money. And then those plans could be taken forward by us certainly adopted by us. It's not giving them the authority. We would still have to do our legal work. And then there's also more details that would be outlined about the development-driven streets, arterial roads. So a lot of good things I think will be done. But we're, with a little help from our city attorney, we'll get it expedited, get it in through fiscal committee review probably next week, but as well onto the agenda for next week. So just know that it's on a fast track, but I think it's a lot of good stuff. And if it could just capture your attention for a few minutes when you see it come through, it would all help us. So any questions about that?
Questions for Councillor Jameson?
Or additional comments from Councillor Karski?
So fiscal committee next week will see it.
Yes.
That's great. Good. Thank you very much for your work, councilors. That's an amazing feat, so it'll be great to have that going. Other open discussion from councilors? I have a couple of housekeeping things for us this afternoon. First of all, we're trying to get a group photo of this council. You'll remember that, and they aren't up yet, but there are formal portraits of the council as a group that generally hang in the paneling squares on either side of the dais here. We need one of this group, and we were talking, some of us sort of internally, we would like to do one outside, and we had proposed Falls Park. Our photographer, Jean's studio, has said that is possible, but it's quite early in the morning that the light is right there. So our staff member, Jim David, has taken a poll, and 4 people are okay with the early morning thing at the falls. 3 of us are not, and 1 has not responded. And so if we're going to do a group portrait, obviously we need the whole group. So I'm looking for thoughts. Do we want to just plan to do it here like it's always been done and just call it good? Is that the will of the group? I'm seeing nods over here. Anyone? Yes, no, maybes? All right, we'll set it up. It will be prior to Tuesday afternoon meeting, as we have done in the past. It'll be like 3 o'clock or something like that. You'll get that message in your email at some point in the future. Thank you. And then committee assignments, you've all received them in an email, and they will be emailed to directors, but I just wanted to read them out loud for the public this afternoon. The audit committee is Greg Jameson. These are our internal committees. Greg Jameson is chair, Sue Aguilar, Jim Entman, Rex Rolfing, our audit committee. Fiscal committee is Dean Karski, chair, Sue Aguilar, Greg Jameson, Jim Entman, members. Public Service Committee is Kenny Anderson, chair, Sue Aguilar, Michelle Erpenbach, and Dean Karski, members. Excuse me. And Land Use Committee is Rex Rolfing, chair, Kermit Staggers, Dean Karski, and Kenny Anderson, members. Operations Committee, as you remember, we elected this 4th person last week. It's Sue Aguilar, Michelle Erpenbach, Jim Entman, and Rex Rolfing as members. That chair will be elected by the group. Those assignments are effective now, so that today's land use meeting will incorporate those members as listed. Again, that'll be on the website, and I will email it to directors so that you know what that is. Any other open discussion? Any other questions, comments about housekeeping? Everybody got their seats moved? That's awesome. We'll do that again in about 6 months. Good job. All right, we'll move on to our presentations. Our first up is the April financial report from Tracy Turbeck, our Director of Finance.
Good afternoon. Tracy Turbeck with the Finance Office. It's good to be back again already. It seems like these monthly reports roll around awfully quick every so often. My report today is the regular monthly financial update through April 30th of 2012. As I've become accustomed to doing, I'll recap some of the economic activity indicators that we do follow in the Finance Office. I'll provide a general fund, kind of a snapshot of the general fund financial activity and results through April 30th. And then this month I want to highlight, provide kind of an overview of the capital program highlights thus far throughout the year. So that's kind of what I have in store for you today. To start it off, I want to talk about unemployment. This is one that should be familiar to all of you. This does show the 2010-2011 unemployment rate here in the Sioux Falls statistical area. And then for 2012, we've got just a couple, actually 3 months worth of data This is typically a month behind just because it takes that long for those statistics to come out. So the April report, the latest unemployment data we have, is actually for the month of March. But you can see that in March, the local unemployment rate did take a slight downward tick from 4.8% last month to 4.7% in March. So that's certainly a positive thing, and I think the preliminary information I've seen in the most current information for April is that we'll see that improve even more a month from now. Of course, the flip side of the unemployment is the number of people actually working. I thought you might be interested to note that in March of 2012, we had 125,275 people working in Sioux Falls or employed. That's up a couple hundred from a month ago, and up about 2,400 from a year ago, and up more than 5,000 from 2 years ago. So that kind of highlights, I think, for you the overall trend in the employment picture here in Sioux Falls. The second indicator that I've been presenting is the building permit activity, and this chart represents the valuation of permits issued, and each month is added to the next. So these are year-to-date indications of the value of building permits issued. The value issued from January through April of 2012 is about $103.5 million of building activity. You can see the green bar there next to the month of April is outpacing last year significantly, and we're ahead of the 2010 figures as well. In fact, we're up about 9% from where we were a year ago, so that's certainly, again, a very positive trend. Some of that, significantly, I think, is in the single-family units. Year-to-date through the end of April, the Building Services Office issued 170 single-family home building permits, and that's an increase of 74 over the first 4 months of last year. So, again, very favorable indication there in the construction activity here locally. The last economic indicator that we like to pay close attention to is the sales tax collections on a rolling 12-month basis. This chart represents the growth rate over a 24-month period of time. We look at the results or the collections in the most recent 12 months and compare those collections with the 12 months prior to that. So you can see that as of the end of April, that 12-month rolling growth rate is at 5.6%. That's up slightly from last month when I reported to you we were at 5.4%. So that's increased a little bit from last month. And you might be interested to know, too, that we ended last calendar year, December of 2011, at 4.5% growth rate. So we've seen that pace of growth improve for the first 4 months of this year. Now switching to the actual results in our general fund for revenue and expenditures for the first 4 months of the year. January through April, we've seen about $25.5 million in revenue in our general fund. That's up about $2.1 million, or about 9%. Most of that growth being coming from the higher than anticipated sales tax increases. So we are seeing some very favorable results in our general fund on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, we're tracking right in line with budget figures. Expenditures are at about $37.6 million through April. That's up about $500,000 in relation to last year for the first 4 months of the year. So again, general fund, we're looking very favorably in terms of our actual financial results. Now, turning to the capital program, I do want to spend a little bit of time providing some highlights. And this information was also provided in your written report that you received electronically. But just to recap, we are continuing to see a competitive bidding environment for our projects. So far in the first 4 months of the year, 38 projects have gone to bid, totaling a little over $26 million. On average, we've received 6 bids for each project. And that low bid on the projects have come in about 6% below estimate. So I feel like we're continuing to get a good value on our projects and stretching those dollars in a very competitive bid environment. Some of the highlights, some major projects that have gone to bid. Of course, the Phase 2 of the River Greenway project. the Prairie West Branch Library, a number of street resurfacing projects, as well as the connection to the Lewis and Clark water supply, and of course the improvements to this building were among those that have gone to bid. To touch on a few of these projects that are in construction, these should all sound pretty familiar to you. The 8th Street project just north of City Hall, there are a couple blocks of 8th Street between Minnesota and Main Avenue that are being reconstructed. The Benson Road and Bob Holland Avenue project, as well as a third Subtitle D landfill cell at our landfill. Lots of activity going on in Sioux Falls these days. Some additional major construction projects. The large sanitary sewer project this year is the South Interceptor replacement. Again, over on the west side, Marion Road reconstruction. If you live over there like I do, you see that activity every day when you go by, so that's kind of exciting to see. And also the Cliff Avenue, on the north end of Cliff Avenue, is being reconstructed as well, as I'm sure you're well aware. In the culture and recreation side of things, we see the play structure replacement projects are in construction. You may have read something about the Falls Park restroom and playground facilities in the paper. That's had some publicity lately, so some good projects happening there as well. We do have a number of projects that are yet to go to bid. Quite a list here on this slide. I won't go through the whole list, but you can see that it's been very busy for the first 4 months of the year in bidding projects, and we've got some work left yet to do in terms of putting some of these other important projects out to bid as well. That concludes the slides that I have. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you folks might have.
Thank you, Tracy. Questions for Mr. Scherbeck?
Going to let me off the hook this month?
One question then. Let's just briefly pull out for the public and for the council those highlight that event center line item. You know, page 9. Is it page 9 where you talk about? No, it's page 8. I apologize. That has the current budget, the capital program fund, and then current budget and the expenses. Still at about 3%. Not a lot of change. But if you could just run through those numbers for the public, that would be great.
Okay, from the Event Center bond construction fund, we have spent about $1 million. There's about another $2.5 million that has been encumbered. And then we also have a small amount budgeted within our sales tax fund, $500,000 that was appropriated in this year's budget, and about $100,000 of that has been spent. Now, as we talked last month, we do plan to incorporate a financial slide, a financial update into our regular monthly event center update presentations. So as you see those going forward, we'll include an update as to how much money has been spent and on what kind of activities those dollars have been spent on. So you'll get a regular update kind of highlighting that particular project as well. So.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Next up, Community Transformation Initiative update by Jill Franken, Director of Health, Alicia Kalura, Assistant Director, and Raina DeBoer, Health and Wellness Coordinator.
Good afternoon, Jill Franken, Public Health Director. We appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon to update you on one of the city's top 10 projects for 2012, the Community Transformation Initiative. Our project team is here, and Alicia Kalura, as project manager, will walk you through the update that we have for you this afternoon. But as an introduction, just to give you a little flavor of what's happening around the country, there's significant movement that's occurring across the nation related to community health and wellness. There's also significant movement throughout the state to target activities that negatively influence health as we look at what's going on in our very state. We also have locally, in Sioux Falls specifically, we have our public health department engaged with the community to reduce the burden of chronic disease currently impacting all sectors of our community. About 1 year ago exactly, we presented to the City Council our Community Health Status Report. A few examples of the negative trends of chronic disease in our community that came out in that report include such issues as increasing incidence of hypertension or high blood pressure, increased incidence of coronary artery disease, and a rise in elevated cholesterol in our community. We also found startling local trends mirrored nationally with regard to increased childhood and adult obesity. Knowing and informing through this report was our first prevention and health promotion step forward towards fixing our public health locally. We are now on our second step. Through our coordinated community transformation initiative, we're taking on these trends by better understanding the causative factors that impact the health of Sioux Falls, setting aims in several key areas, whereby reducing the burden of disease to ultimately make Sioux Falls a healthier community. I'll now turn it over to Alicia to provide the project update. Thank you.
Thank you. I am Alicia Kalura, Assistant Director of Public Health, and I'm going to try to explain a little bit about the why and the how of the work that we're going to do. Through the Prevention and Public Health Fund, healthcare dollars are being put towards prevention. Health experts and officials recognize that our old paradigm of sick care rather than well care needs revision and improvement. In 2011, $100 million in Community Transformation Grants, or CTG, was released to our communities throughout the nation. The goal of the Community Transformation Grant is to create healthier communities by making healthy living easier and more affordable where people work, live, learn, and play. South Dakota received approximately $800,000 a year for the next 5 years, with Sioux Falls receiving about $150,000 a year for the next 5 years. Through this funding, the Health Department has pledged to do 5 things. One is to maintain a multi-sector coalition to help assist us in developing recommendations for policy, system, and environmental changes. 2 is to utilize this coalition to complete a community health needs assessment. This community health needs assessment started in March of this year, and we are about midway through that data collection effort. Whenever we talk about this, though, we need to go back to the why, and the why is really chronic disease and its effects on our communities. We're at the point now where 1 in 2 adults suffer from chronic disease, so just think about that in terms of your own family or your own friends. And 7 out of 10 deaths in our nation are caused by chronic disease. The most important thing to remember, though, is that these are largely preventable. Of course, nothing is absolute, and some are not preventable, but for the most part, chronic diseases are preventable. The chart that you have in the presentation represents the impact of chronic disease in our local Minnehaha and Lincoln County data. This is the causes of death, 2006 to 2010. And you can see the top 3 leading causes are chronic diseases, including cancer, heart disease, and respiratory disease. There are other items on the list, such as diabetes and liver disease, that would be chronic as well. And this graph here only really shows us the death. It doesn't show us how many people are sickened or the effects on our community or our economy. So the top 2 contributors to chronic disease are tobacco and obesity. Tobacco is still the #1 cause of preventable death in the nation. There's a graph presented that shows you that throughout the decades, remarkable progress has been made in declining the rates of tobacco use. However, at the very end of that graph are a few years that are in red, and this red is a trend line that's getting stagnant, and that trend line is what's causing some more focused efforts on tobacco and why tobacco was such a prominent piece of the CTG grants. Some other key things to remember is that 12% of Sioux Falls residents still smoke. 12% of youth in South Dakota will smoke a cigarette before the age of 18. Smoking causes over 400,000 deaths per year. 4,000 young people try their first cigarette every day in the U.S., with about 1,000 of those becoming addicted. We also know some other statistics, such as 7 in 10 smokers would like to quit, that fewer places to smoke equals more quit attempts, And we also know that there are cost-effective, evidence-based strategies to reduce tobacco use in our communities. One of them is limiting the exposure to children of those using tobacco. Focusing on youth exposure is a strategic aim to stop smoking before it starts. Almost 70% of adults began smoking before they turned 18. Most smokers try their first cigarette around 11, and many are addicted by the time they're 14. The second leading cause of preventable death in our communities is obesity. It is rising in adults and children, and there has been some positive trending in the last few years. We're seeing that the obesity rates are not climbing as steeply as they were before, but they are not leveling and they are not reversing. New predictions are that by 2030, 42% of Americans will be obese, and this does not include overweight. Sioux Falls is no exception to those trends. We see that 67% of adults are overweight or obese, 34% of our children are overweight or obese, and one of the indicators that they're looking at closely at the state level is the surprising statistic that Sioux Falls, in particular, ranks as the worst in the nation for the consumption of fruits and vegetables. Disease does cause more than illness and death. It also costs our communities real dollars. We have asked the state to assist us with a project so that we're able to perform an analysis of the cost savings to our communities with the investment of the Community Transformation Grants. However, in the meantime, there's little argument that the impact of healthcare costs on our nation and our families is growing. At this time, we already know that 7 out of 10 healthcare dollars are spent on chronic disease. 1 in 5 healthcare dollars are spent on diabetes, and another $1 is spent on cardiovascular disease. So for instance, if you are a smoker, your annual healthcare costs will be $2,000 a year higher. If you're obese, $1,400 higher than someone who's non-obese, and if you have diabetes, over $6,000 higher than if you did not have diabetes. So we do know that healthcare costs are detrimental to our economy, and that public health prevention measures are sound investments. A 2008 Trust for America's Health study revealed that effective public health disease prevention programs can be implemented at a low cost, and for our area in particular, South Dakota, can create about a 5-to-1 return on investment for our communities. So that's a little bit about the why. So the how. Well, when we wrote our grant, we did commit to 3 strategic directions. One is tobacco-free living. As I mentioned, there are multiple evidence-based strategies being implemented in our region, in our state even, including things such as smoke-free multi-unit housing and smoke-free public spaces. Minnesota is a leader in our region who has many counties around the state that have implemented smoke-free public spaces. In our own state, Yankton and Watertown also have smoke-free public space policy. So during this period of assessment and research, we'll be working with our community needs assessment, with our internal city partners, with our external stakeholders, to look at crafting an approach that would be suitable for Sioux Falls. One key area of our focus, again, will be to look at reducing exposure to youth. The second goal is to reduce the rate of obesity in our communities. And this is really looked at through our built environment, how we created the environment that got us to where we are today, that we can also reverse that by creating an environment that encourages healthy living. Improving the built environment means looking at things like walkability, bikeability, safe routes to school, access to green space, access to fresh foods. So our first step is to really work with our internal partners and look at our long-term planning for Sioux Falls and evaluate where public health policies already exist. And where they do exist, how can we be a resource to help bring those to life? The third goal is to increase access and demand for high-impact quality preventative services, and we achieve this through the Big Squeeze. The Big Squeeze is a project that we became involved with about 2 years ago to promote blood pressure screenings and cardiovascular health in Sioux Falls. It began with a grassroots effort of public and private entities to bring awareness to this particular health issue. Partners such as Lewis Drug, American Heart Association, Dakota Care, and parish nurses, among many others, were really the seed for this effort. In 2011, through the use of volunteers, we were able to screen 2,500 Sioux Falls residents, and for 2012, which we're now wrapping up our May events, we aim to increase that to 5,000. Our hope by the end of the 5-year project period is that we're screening as many as 15,000 Sioux Falls residents a year, and that we align our effort with the American Heart Association Million Hearts campaign, as well as pilot test and include other types of screenings such as BMI, tobacco use, and cholesterol. The Big Squeeze, we're pleased to welcome Walgreens and Sioux Falls Fire Rescue into our partnership this year. So, all over this country, public health is changing its face a little bit in response to the chronic disease that has had such a high impact. Other examples of success across our nation are in Chicago, 556 parks have access to healthy vending, 100% healthy vending, in fact. And I'll just mention that our own library director, Mary Johns, she's been a very positive supporter of this effort, and after our kickoff meeting, she went back to her department and asked her staff to help her implement healthy vending at the Sioux Falls libraries, not only for staff but for the public as well. Over 130 employees in Stark County, Ohio have access to inside and outside mapped walking routes at more than 70 workplaces to encourage physical activity. Again, this is a very low-cost, evidence-based strategy that affects over 130,000 people. Healthy snacks such as granola bars, fruits, vegetables, and water are served at all city agency meetings and events in Miami, Florida. And then approximately 36,000 residents in Longview, Washington are protected from secondhand smoke in 11 of the city's 17 parks, with 6 other having designated tobacco use areas. Again, another strategy that was designed specifically for that community. As a top 10 city project, I'd just like to introduce the project team to you. Of course, Jill Franken is the project sponsor, and I'm the project manager. We've also welcomed Jennifer Johnson into our department, who has a background in health promotion, and she is leading 2 of our 3 strategies. Human Resources has been very supportive and has given us the ability to work with Rana DeBoer, the city's health and wellness coordinator. She's working on our built environment, or healthy foods and active lifestyle project. And then we're also working with Jean Reed. She's helping navigate us through the community health needs assessment process with many, many other community partners. I would like to say while I'm up here that there are other departments and numerous community organizations that are working closely with us, and so I thank them for their support and their resources. I've included a slide of our 1-year deliverables, again, because this is a City Top 10 project. I won't review these again with you because they do speak to everything that I've outlined, but these are the 1-year goals that we're hoping to have completed for you. I will also mention that the community health assessment is about the midway point, and that would probably be the next time that you would see me bring an update to you as council on the results of that survey. Finally, just to share with you, thank you to Kathy Rustwick. We have settled on this logo for Live Well Sioux Falls. We also have a draft of our webpage. This is at siouxfalls.org under the city's top 10 projects. So I welcome you to take a look at this. There are updates in this. We'll also have a newsletter, which we presented one about a month ago, and this will be available for updates to the public as well. While we've been rolling these things out slowly to our partners and our committees, the hope would be that by the end of the 5-year project period, that Live Well will be a recognizable preventative health initiative within the City of Sioux Falls. So I thank you, and again, I'll mention our project team is here if you'd like to have any questions or comments.
Questions of Alicia? Councilor Staggers.
Yeah, I just have a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
Obese, a lot of people hear that word, but are not really quite sure how it's defined. Can you tell
Sure.
us what an obese person, how much they weigh?
Well, obesity is going to be different with every person depending on not only your height, but your weight as well. So I don't have a magic number that this weight equals obesity, but I could get you some information on BMI and how to translate that to anyone's height to understand if they fall into obese or overweight.
Because you mentioned the percent, 67% of adults are overweight or obese. I know a lot of people are overweight, but I'm just not quite sure how many are actually obese because we're combining overweight and obese together.
Of this number, I think it's 30%. It's between 30 and 35%. I actually just combined that today, but it was really, really close to the youth number. Over 30% obese.
Over 30% of adults are obese
In Sioux Falls.
in Sioux
Yes,
Falls.
that data comes from the CDC through the states. They deliver, it's called a behavioral factor risk assessment, and it's done in every state, and it's a phone call survey. And the same data is collected year after year so that it's comparable, and that's where we pulled this data from.
Okay. And then just one other question. You mentioned at the beginning that 1 in 2 adults suffer from chronic disease.
Yes.
I know we're not in perfect health, but, human beings are not in perfect health, but 50% of us in this room are suffering from a chronic disease.
Well, I don't know specific to this room. It could be different in community, but that would be relative to the nation.
Okay. Thank you.
And again, we do try to pull all of our data and resources from reputable sources, and so that one comes from the CDC.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions for Alicia or for Jill or the team? I have a question. You throw out letters, and I always want to know. Tell us what BMI is.
Body mass index.
Body mass index.
Yes.
I was at the doctor for an unrelated thing the other day, and they gave me my BMI. Tell me how they figured that.
That is what I was referring to as it's a combination of your height and weight. The BMI is not a perfect measurement of your body mass, but it's one that's acceptable at this time. There are other ways. There's waist circumference and things like that, but they would have come up with your BMI with a height and weight measurement and then plotted it on a chart.
And then there was a scale that told me whether I was overweight or healthy weight or
Yes.
whatever. So that
Yes.
fairly easy to figure out. So BMI,
Yes.
look it up on the internet, right? Anything else for the team? Thank you very much, Alicia. Very
Thanks.
in-depth. We're excited to see this moving along.
Thank you.
Next presentation, should we have a drum roll? The management RFP update. Mike Cooper, Director of Planning and Building Services.
Good afternoon, members of the council. Mike Cooper, Planning and Building Services. This is a non-PowerPoint presentation today. For the last few months, as we've done our monthly updates with you, we discussed that one of the key steps in the event center development process is to identify a facility manager as well as a food and beverage service provider. And just by way of a background, we currently have agreements for SMG to manage the arena and Orpheum Theater. And that agreement for the arena goes back to 2001 when they were first identified as SMG. Prior to that, it was Ogden. In 2004, SMG took over management of the Orpheum Theater when that became a city asset. The convention center has been managed by Global Spectrum since 2007, and prior to that it was John Q. Hammonds by way of the Sheraton. Global Spectrum, we also have a separate contract currently with Ovations for food and beverage services at the convention center. So we have multiple contracts that we've had in place for a number of years. Our current agreements with SMG, Global Spectrum, and Ovations will go through the end of this year. So it was key for us, as we talked about the event center, to bring things under one umbrella in terms of facility manager and food and beverage service. And that was a recommendation that even went back prior to the special election for the event center. So as we went through this process, we identified the names of a selection committee that was recommended, including city and non-city representatives. The selection committee members consisted of Raquel Blount, Kathy Clark, Dale Froelich, Bill Townsend, Karen Leonard, Darren Smith, Tracy Turbeck. We also entered into an agreement with a consultant, Crossroads Consulting Services, to help us with the selection process, and then also the next step, which is contract negotiations. We put together a timeline for you that we've been able to stay on track fairly close. We're about 2 weeks out from what we had early anticipated. Back in March, there were 2 separate RFPs issued for facility management services as well as for food and beverage services. Those proposals came to us about mid-April, and that's when the selection committee began to meet to review the proposals. And then going into May, they spent a considerable amount of time interviewing all the different companies that submitted proposals, and then working on finalizing their recommendations. And I can tell you that the amount of information that they were asked to go through would fill up a good-sized box. It was very detailed. They put a lot of time and effort into this, and they took it very seriously. So today, we've reached the point that we would like to announce to you the recommendation by the selection committee. And to do that, the committee has asked Dale Froelich to come up and give you that announcement. And before Dale comes up, because he may repeat this as well, it's important for you to know today that this is a recommendation, and this recommendation is going to be subject to 2 key steps after today. The intent is to award these contracts subject to final negotiation, and then those contracts will have to be reviewed and approved by you, the city council members. So you have a key role in the final agreements that are brought forward for consideration. But it was important for the committee to be unbiased, transparent in their review of these proposals, and to give you a very fair recommendation that will now move forward into the next step, which is the private negotiations, and then getting city council involvement in the final agreements, and then your approval ultimately. We hope to do that over the next few weeks and months. So today, to give you an oversight of the process and the recommendation, I'd like to turn it over to Dale Froelich.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the council. It's my pleasure to be here. I think Mike did a nice job of outlining how we have been acting and conducting ourselves over the last 10 weeks. The initial RFPs came out March 9th, and the written materials were all received in mid-April. I can tell you, as one of 7 members of the committee, 3 city staff and 4 citizens, that this was a very complicated review process and very detailed. These are extremely competent bidders, and the industry itself is very complex. The contracts that will arise from this process are quite detailed and mean a lot, both from a monetary point of view, but also from a quality of life point of view for our entire city. So we received those materials. We read about 800 pages of written materials. We conducted full-scale interviews for 2 solid days, 8 hours each day from 8 until 5, actually about 4:30 each day. We checked references with help from city staff. We had the benefit of several assistant personnel from the city finance office and also from city purchasing, and of course Mike Cooper from city planning. We checked all those references and we tried to find other comparable venues in the nation that would be comparable to our complex of four facilities, because we knew our decision would affect not only the current Orpheum, the arena, the current convention center, but also the new event center. So this is a complex of 4 major facilities, and the decision here basically is all or nothing for all 4 of those venues. Most significantly, we had a lot of help from our consultants. Susan Seeger, who's the president of Crossroads, was here in Sioux Falls and spent the days with us, and also several hours on the phone following. Gloria Pinkerton and Chris Bigelow from the Bigelow Companies helped us with the food and beverage decision. And the reason why it's maybe 2 weeks longer than what you first anticipated is that when we got to the end of all of this input, we decided, we had sort of a sense of what we wanted to see at that point, what we thought was the right decision. But then we also engaged a best and final offer process. So we went back to each one of the bidders, 2 companies for the management and operations contract and 2 separate companies, 2 sister companies for the food and beverage. And we asked a best and final position from each of those 4 companies. So we got those best and final offer positions, and about 10 days ago, Friday, 2 weeks ago, we made our decision on the food and beverage, and last Friday we voted and made our decision on the management contract. So the recommendation of our committee is that the management and operations contract be awarded to SMG, and our recommendation is that the food and beverage contract be awarded to Ovations. These are positions and recommendations that come in the food and beverage category with a unanimous decision of all 7 of our members, and a very strong recommendation, strong majority, not unanimous, but very strong majority, that SMG be awarded the management and operations position. I want to say that it's our belief that each one of these bidders is extremely well qualified, and it was really quite a hard decision. The points that separate these two bidders on the management side are significant, but I can tell you that both bidders are able to perform in a very significant way. SMG is slightly larger as a bidder, as an operator, and brings a little more to the table in terms of experience and stability. But without getting into all of the details as to, without rehashing, our deliberations, I can tell you that we really followed about 6 different factors in making our decision. We looked at the experience and qualifications of each bidder. We looked at the quality of the management team that they were presenting, that they were going to put on site here in Sioux Falls, because we believe personnel is such a critical part of the future operation. We looked at their approach toward operations, We looked at their effort toward marketing and sales. What kind of marketing effort will they bring to actually use these venues for the benefit of the entire citizenry of this region? We looked at their proposed financial compensation. How much money are they projecting from their operations, and what does that mean, frankly, for the City of Sioux Falls and for the city budget? And then we also looked at their ability, their past ability, their financial stability. We checked their references and came to this conclusion after a lot of deliberation. I would say that this was a very educational process for me, and I think all of the members of our committee. I probably personally spent about 150 hours on this process, trying to figure out which of the bidders was best suited for our community. Our entire committee wants the best result possible for the new event center and the best result going forward for our citizens who have approved this new event center. This is for a 5-year contract, and of course the new event center will open up in 2014. So, as Mike mentioned, our recommendation now goes forward to a contract negotiation process, and we fully expect that there will be continued deliberations between the city and the bidders in that contract negotiation process. Ultimately, what really counts is the contracts that are signed between the city and the performers. And those are the contracts that you, the City Council, would ultimately be approving. So maybe I should stop there and answer questions. I know that there's a collateral process also significant to the city in which there are contracts for the actual construction of the facility. All of these, both of these companies were willing to be involved in the design and engineering, trying to assist the city to save money in the process of building the facility. And of course, they both offered to provide some assistance in the naming rights process as the city finds revenues from a variety of other sources in addition to just operations. So all of those things, it's a very fluid process. All of those things are simultaneously going to be going on and going into the future. But the most significant thing today is that our committee does recommend SMG for the operations, and we recommend Ovations for food and beverage.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Froelich. Thank you for your service, and thanks to the committee on behalf of the council. I know it was a lot of work. That's a lot of time commitment. We appreciate it. Questions from council members for Mr. Froelich or Mr. Cooper, starting with Councilor Jameson.
Yes, again, I'd like to thank you, Dale, and all your staff, all the people who are on that committee for all your work. That's a lot of time and effort. And I appreciate it. We appreciate it, I know. It's actually really a question for Mike, if I could. I'm just trying to get a grip of the dollar amounts. Last year, do you know just, or maybe Tracy can help too, but last year, what did we pay SMG and what did we pay Global total? It seems like this contract, for some reason, has captured the attention and the imagination of everybody that I talk to who wants to know about it. This, I suppose, in public transit, but do you have those dollar amounts just to give me some kind of a reference?
Yeah, I can put those together for you, but I think what we can do is go back, say, the last 3 to 5 years and give you a little history of what those contracts were, because they did change from year to year.
I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, we can put that together just as a comparison.
Would it be helpful for the rest of the group or just maybe? Because I think when we make this decision, I think it's good for us to put it in perspective on what kind of dollar amounts we're really expecting to spend.
I'm seeing
the one thing that you want to remember is that both parties have offered the city projections of future revenues coming from these 4 facilities, and the revenues are different for each facility from each bidder. The proposed benefit to the city comes from a combination of commissions, base fees. You know, the reason why there are two contracts is because the city's position in regard to food and beverages is substantially different than the city's position in regard to the actual operation of the facility. You know, the operation of the facility is governed by IRS regulations because it's actually funded with tax-exempt bonds, and so the city has to meet certain criteria for the operations of the facility. In that regard, that requires or intends a base fee. Whereas on food and beverage, which is a subcomponent of the operation, there the city can participate on a percentage of the gross. So when you're looking at these numbers, you're going to be looking at a series of numbers, and you're going to want to compare both historically and their pro formas and their as far as projections, and then also their splits that they would offer the city.
Good, thank you. Councilor Staggers.
Yes, Dale. Dale, in the past, some of the management teams have said, well, we raise this amount of money, we might be able to reduce subsidies and things like that, city subsidies to the facilities. Were there any statements about maybe managing the Orpheum a certain way? They would eliminate the subsidy there, or the convention center. Is there any possibility, in other words, that we can have a reduction in city subsidies for these facilities?
Well, these bidders are telling the city that they will pay a base fee for the privilege of managing the facility. And then they're also telling the city that they will give the city a split of the gross sales from food and beverage. And they do project growth in food and beverage. Through the process of first offer to best and final offer, their base fees did change substantially, which in fact was a reduction of cost to the city. So I think there is a gain in terms of reduction of subsidy, but I think it's unreasonable for the city to expect that these facilities would be entirely paid through the process of the operations or the food and beverage. There always will be some city support in our estimation.
Yeah, because what happened, the consultants on the event center said under some good conditions, we might not have a subsidy for that.
I would just echo to what Dale said, that part of the answer to your question, Councilor, is that the bottom line, when we look at the overall revenue and expenses, as we've said all along, is that the naming rights, sponsorships will play a big role in the overall bottom line. And so we're still working through that process, as you know. But we are going to end up paying a management fee to the companies to run the facilities. But what the overall, as you say, subsidy would be is going to be determined in part by these contracts as well as the sponsorships that we're working on.
One other comment that I think is relevant to your question, because that was of interest to me as well, is the fact that both of our consultants told us very point blank that Sioux Falls sits in a privileged position to have these major competitors bidding so aggressively for the privilege of managing this new facility probably has resulted in the fact that Sioux Falls is paying, compared to other facilities and other venues across the nation, our base fee may be as little as 1/2 of what might otherwise be normal because of the competitive process. But there still will be a base fee, and it will be offset by naming rights.
Thank you. Councilor Anderson.
Mike Cooper, please. Mike, since we brought up naming rights, it's something I've had on the back of my mind for a while here. I noticed that Councilman Smith isn't here, or excuse me, that Darren Smith is not here, or I'd be asking him this question. Public Services Committee started working with Darren to create a policy on how we're going to do the naming rights for this facility and many other facilities or areas in our city. That stopped after we started the naming right negotiations. We haven't had any update. We haven't had any communication from Darren other that they're moving forward. Is this not putting the carriage before the horse? I think that we need to speak with Darren as far as public services. We need to have some type of update from him so that we can move forward with a naming rights policy before you come forward to us with a naming rights contract.
Our next monthly update, I believe, is on the 12th or 13th, the 12th.
I think it
So
should be
that's something-
before that, Mike.
Okay. I know we'll discuss it with him.
Yeah.
I would just also comment that in terms of our next steps in this process, that because the council is going to be involved in approving these contracts, that it would be good maybe to have a discussion with leadership as to how we go through the contract negotiation process, because it is obviously going to be a private process, and then how that will involve the city council in terms of your review and ultimately your final approval. So we'd like to work together with you on how that is going to take place from now on.
That would be appreciated. Councilor Hinterman and I will work with you to kind of iron out the details for that. Again, keeping in mind that council is going to have that final say.
Yes.
But that the negotiations really are private, proprietary. We want to make sure we do all of these things in the right way and transparent as possible. Councilor Hinterman, next question.
Quick question. I guess one of the questions that I might have, different questions. On the contract management side, when we look at the contracts, are we also involving not just city staff in that deal, but are we anticipating involving some folks from possibly your committee to be involved during this contract negotiation? Or how, can you tell me, is that going to be handled?
This recommendation will, from our committee, will now go to the city attorney's office for actual contract negotiations. But the city attorney's office will have two major resources. They will have the benefit of working with both consultants, with Crossroads and with the Bigelow companies, and those consultants are very expert in the details of contract negotiations. And the city attorney's office, to my understanding, has also hired outside counsel to assist in this process. So I don't know how long the contract negotiation will take, but I think there will be quite a bit of firepower on the side of the city to make sure that it happens correctly.
Great, thank you. I guess just a comment, if I might.
Yes.
I must say that it had been extremely challenging challenge that you had choosing these. It's been my experience in working with both of these companies on a business level over the years that they're both extreme professionals at what they do. All three of the companies were, and I'm very happy that we've settled on one of them. I think it was the goal of a couple of us when we got elected to the city council. And I know a lot of comments from the councilors here that, we were hopeful that we'd have one management group because it only makes sense, from that standpoint as far as managing multiple facilities. You save on equipment costs, manpower costs, all of those different things. So it really does make sense. That in itself should help with somewhat of a savings. And I'd like to thank both of those folks for being patient, both of those companies for being patient with the process. And I really do look forward to working with them as we go forward here in the future.
And both companies were able to detail some savings from the fact that they would be managing the entire facility, that in fact there would be less overhead for each of the individual facilities by combining that process. And you should also remember that if for some reason there turns out to be a difficulty during the contract negotiation process, we do have a good fallback position in the fact that the number 2 bidder here is still very well qualified, to really firm up the city's gain here. We really have to now write a contract that actually details the promises that are being made so that we know exactly how much savings will happen in terms of staffing, in terms of upfront money, in terms of design, and also in terms of assistance to the naming rights process. I don't want to speak for Darren Smith, but it was an education to me to know how revenue is derived through a complex naming rights process. It's not just the name for the facility as a whole, it's the name that goes on the facility, also many of the suites, also many of the attributes that are offered through the food and beverage process, through the marketing and advertising budget. And these companies are quite expert in terms of maximizing to their gain and to the city's gain that naming right potential. They are experienced in branding, and they know that this is a unique opportunity with the arrival of a new event center to basically revisit the brand that we have here in Sioux Falls and expose it to the nation as a whole in terms of entertainment. And all of that can mean additional revenue to the city of Sioux Falls. So I think, you know, I'm sure that our community would love to know what's the name of the new facility going to be, but in fact, naming rights is complex and it involves a whole panoply of privileges that people are willing to pay for. And that's why I think these processes go hand in hand.
Good, thank you. Councilor Karski.
Yes, first of all, Mr. Froelich, thank you for the time. You talk 150 hours, 4 weeks, 40 hours a week. That it adds up, and I know.
I hope I'm not exaggerating, but I think it's true.
No, and I believe you, and I know that many of the people that served with you on your committee, I know most of them personally, and I think we had a very well qualified committee to be involved in this process, and I thank all of them for their time too. Question for Mr. Cooper, if I might. Regarding the negotiations, and I know the process that was gone through to have these companies come to us with their bid was pretty involved. We're very specific in our requests to them, I'm sure, as far as what we wanted to see. So when we talk about the private negotiations part of this, timeline, will this be brought to us as a council in executive session so we can see that? What are we looking at for time frame?
The time frame, best case scenario would be 30 days that we can crank this out fairly quickly. That's probably being overly optimistic. It might take 3 months, but what we would like to do is, as we move through this process, again, as I mentioned earlier, is work with the council leadership to determine what is the best way to communicate with you as we're working through these negotiations. We don't want to just lay something on your lap at a public meeting and say, would you approve this? We don't want to do it that way. So I think as we work through these details and as we start to see or get some indication of how long it is going to take, that maybe we can sit down and just talk about how the process is going to work.
Right, and we'll keep you posted as to how that's going.
But the 3 months to 30 days is kind of what we have been told could potentially be the time frame.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from council? We have a pretty key role in this, so let's make sure we're covering all our bases.
It's important to remember that the existing contracts go through the end of the year, and it's really important to do it right rather than to do it quick. So.
Good advice. Thank you, Mr. Froelich, and again to the committee, thank you very much. We appreciate the presentation. Moving on.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I forgot to, again, Dale talked about the hours that he put in. I think the others did it in less time than that. No, I'm just kidding. Seriously, we just need to put a big thank you out there to all the members of the selection committee, particularly the non-city members, because they did this on their own time. They got a couple lunches out of the deal, but that was about it. So again, thank you very much to Raquel Blount with Lloyd Companies, Kathy Clark with Wells Fargo, obviously Dale Froelich and Bill Townsend with Howell McDowell Insurance. So again, if you see those folks, thank them, and we appreciate their time and service towards this important step.
Good, thank you. Moving on to the next presentation, the nuisance vegetation and forestry ordinance revisions. Kevin Smith, Assistant Director of Planning, and Kelby Maris, Park Operations Manager.
Good afternoon, Kevin Smith with Planning and Building Services. In late 2010, Planning and Building Services met with Parks and Recreation to discuss transition of the nuisance vegetation program. During that transition period, which we did complete in 2011, both sides agreed there needed to be some modifications to the ordinance. Essentially, right now, everything dealing with vegetation is in Chapter 42. What we're requesting through this proposed change is to move the language regarding grass and weeds from Chapter 42 to Chapter 11, which covers building and property maintenance, since it's our property maintenance inspectors who are now responsible for the program. I would say the one substantive change that we are proposing has to do with an exemption for the right-of-way of rural section roads, and by that I mean basically country roads within the city limits of Sioux Falls. Best example would be North Marion Road from 60th Street North down to about Maple. There's no curb and gutter, very steep side ditches. It is essentially a rural area on both sides. We're requesting an exemption from the 8-inch requirement in those areas, along with also undeveloped properties or undeveloped areas where we have large tracts of land that is ready to be developed for residential purposes, but just hasn't yet. We're requesting that those just be mowed back for about 25 feet so they kind of fit in with the neighborhood. And in both cases, you still have to meet the requirements of the state law regarding noxious weeds, and primarily in our part of the country, that's Canadian thistles and other varieties of thistles. Those still need to be handled, but we're trying to be reasonable with property owners and with ourselves in terms of what we enforce. We have presented this ordinance to the Home Builders Association, and they didn't seem to have any issues with it. And I know that Kelby and Dwayne Stahl have also presented this to the Park Board, so they've had a chance to look at it. But essentially, this just memorializes, at least from our perspective, the transition from Parks and Recreation to our property maintenance staff to handle the grass and weed ordinance. And I'll just like to finish my part of this before I turn it over to Kelby by saying that I'm sure there's people who wonder, why do we even require people to mow the lawn? What value is that in our community? And when those people call me, I'll usually tell them first, because your neighbor complained about it. And secondly, and more importantly, that this is just one community standard the city has adopted. And in my opinion, what I've learned in property maintenance is if you let every little thing go, pretty soon you have big problems. And I probably talked to every one of you council members at a different time about some property maintenance problem, whether it's garbage on properties that's a nuisance, whether it's vegetation that is overgrown. These are minimum property standards, and I think by enforcing these as well as we do, as fairly as we do, really helps us maintain neighborhoods that we don't get real rundown areas. It is just one tool in the toolbox of property maintenance, and it is by far, in my opinion, the easiest city ordinance to abide by. Just mow the lawn, keep it down to 8 inches, spray the weeds when you see them. So I don't believe any of our ordinances in this case are unreasonable. These changes make sense to me. We've spent a lot of time going over them, and we would just ask for your support. Do you have any questions before I turn it over to Kelby?
Questions for Kevin Smith? Councilor Anderson.
Yeah, Kevin, when you're talking about changing the height restrictions for grass, weeds, whatever in a vacant lot, what size lots are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about large undeveloped areas. Individual lots, as we did last year, if there was a single lot here or there, the developers had to mow them. And if we have properties where there was a house that was demolished, that still needs to be mowed down to 8 inches. What we're looking at is the large tracts of unplatted lands within the city. If a developer has 40 acres, 30 acres that just hasn't been platted and developed yet. That's where we're saying, geez, we don't expect you to have to mow all of that to 8 inches, but certainly individual vacant lots where there was a demolition or a house moved, I think to fit in with existing neighborhoods, especially in the central part of town, those do need to be mowed, and we wouldn't want to see those exempted.
Okay, then I guess these large plots that you're talking, the 40 acres, if they're next to a development, what height are we going to allow them to go to? I guess I just don't want to have hip-deep grass in some of these large developments within the city.
Well, most, I wouldn't say most, but some of them are actually used for ag purposes where your owners are encouraged to have somebody come in and hay it and take care of it that way if it's used for an ag purpose. But what we did last summer was say you have to mow it back at least a 25-foot buffer and maintain the noxious weeds. And by spraying, it did keep, I'd say, the nuisance vegetation down.
If you get a complaint on a property like this, how are you going to handle that then?
Well, typically the developers have been very understanding when we've called and said, hey, you need to do more, that they need some standards to go by too. Somewhere between 8 inches and doing nothing is where we'd like to land. And we're proposing this language in hopes that we can be reasonable with home builders and developers and yet still meet the standards of developed neighborhoods. And anytime, Councilor Anderson, there's that transition between everything that's fully built out and all I see is a field, we have a lot of issues to deal with. But I think the biggest thing is just staying in communication with both sides and finding some common ground. Okay. So if this doesn't work, we'll be back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Councilor Rolfing.
Kevin, you talked about that strip of land or that road going north of 60th Street, Marion Road. What you said, I think I heard you say that would continue to be mowed. It just wouldn't be.
No, we're saying that doesn't need to be mowed to 8 inches, but if there's any noxious weeds like thistles in there, those do need to be sprayed and maintained.
Why wouldn't we mow that? I mean, it's a highway, and it would seem to me that's inside the city limits, and we mow interstate highways. Why wouldn't we mow that 2-3 times a year?
Well, like I said, typically it's treated as a rural area, and we've talked about it internally about what benefit is there to having it mowed. Are we just spending $6,000 to $8,000 a year out of the parks budget to go cut the grass if it doesn't prove beneficial? And we have had discussions internally about whether or not there is a need prior to snow season to have it mowed down, but to require it to be 8 inches like we do everything else just didn't seem reasonable for either for us or for an adjacent property owner who's got land along one of those rural, I would say, rural right-of-ways.
Well, as you know, I've had some complaints from constituents up there in that housing development just on the east side of that road that feel that if that isn't cut before snow falls, it does gather more snow there. And so for not cutting it, I think it would be if we would at least get that at least in the fall.
If we have to work out something with the street department to have those sections of those mowed, I guess we can. What we're trying to accomplish is to not, through ordinance, put that responsibility on the adjoining property owner, which right. I guess is one of our main goals here, is that if we don't really see the benefit to it, then why make the adjoining property owner maintain it? Some still do, and you can see all sorts of locations around town where if the ditches aren't too steep, the adjoining property owner, just maybe because they like to mow that much, will go right up to the edge. But we're trying to create a minimum standard. And as I said to Councilor Anderson, with the undeveloped areas, if this doesn't work, we'll come back. But we're just trying to be reasonable.
Any other questions for Mr. Smith? Okay, Kelby?
Good afternoon. Kelby Maris with Parks and Recreation. With this ordinance change and moving the vegetation out of Chapter 42, it left us an opportunity in Parks and Recreation to take what was left of Chapter 42, basically all the stuff that dealt with trees and woody vegetation, and make that an ordinance that we would then rename vegetation to forestry. And in that process, we did a little bit of housekeeping in that to clean some things up because there was some redundancy within the ordinance as it related to vegetation and trees. So one of the things that we added to the ordinance was in the defining of a nuisance tree, we added insect infested to dead and diseased. So now the nuisance trees would be dead, diseased, and insect infested. We also consolidated the order to remove portion of the ordinance. It was in 2 different articles. Now it would just be in one for an order to remove of one of those nuisance trees. We also are proposing to add the removal of stumps to trees that are removed in the right-of-way. When the tree is removed, then we would like that stump removed as well for various reasons, especially in snow pickup operations. Obviously, you can't see the tree stump. Hitting the tree stump as you're trying to pick up the snow does create some issues. Chapter 42 at one point had rules, planting rules in ordinance for trees, distances away from stop signs, street lights, fire hydrants, that kind of thing. We took it out of ordinance and made to maintain a list of rules. That's not working very well for us, so we're proposing that we bring those rules and regulations back into ordinance to help back that up for us when we do have some issues. Probably the biggest change would be in the arborist licensing portion. We would change the passing score for the arborist exam from 70% to 80%. The test hasn't changed in several years, and we're finding that 70% is not probably not the best in licensing of our ordinance or of our arborists. And we would also change the waiting period for someone who does not pass the test from 24 hours to 2 weeks. What we've noticed in some cases is someone will come in and take the test at 11 o'clock in the morning on Monday, they'll fail, they'll come back at noon on Tuesday, they'll fail, they'll come back on Wednesday at 1, they'll fail, on Thursday they'll get a 72, and they walk out the door with their license. And not exactly sure that's the best thing for our community. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions regarding the forestry portion of this ordinance change.
Questions for Kelby? Councilor Staggers.
You happen to mention something about the tree stumps in the boulevard.
Mm-hmm.
Am I correct that that's the responsibility for the city to get the tree stump out because it is in the city boulevard?
It is not. It's still the responsibility of the abutting property owner. We do have a street tree removal contract where we will remove a number of nuisance trees every year, and within that, we do remove the stumps. But if you have a tree in your boulevard that you just want to remove, that's fine. We'll issue a permit for you to remove that tree, but we also want you to remove the stump as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Councilor Jameson.
Kelby, as well as the stumps on the boulevard, if there's a storm that comes through the city and tears down some trees, would the city then come back by and pick up those trees and then, or a lot of those trees, and then remove the stumps? Is that part of the current system?
It is. We do storm damage removal.
Storm damage.
And as part of our street tree removal contract, those are other trees that we list for that contract. If there's not an immediate danger, however, the tree has been impacted enough that we feel it should be removed later in the year, we'll add that to our street tree removal contract and have that tree and stump removed at that time. If, however, the tree is split in half and we need to take it down at that point due to the storm, we will also come back and remove that stump as well.
Now, one other follow-up question on the height of the grass that we were talking about earlier, you and I had worked together on the wildlife management program. What is that extra height in the grass potentially going to do to harbor wildlife or ducks or geese?
Well, in the form of geese and waterfowl, when vegetation is allowed to grow tall next to bodies of water, it creates an area where the waterfowl don't like to stay because they can't see the predators then in the tall grass. So then they usually pick a more desirable location. In a lot of our storm drainage areas, we're not finding a whole lot of wildlife that we're not finding in other places. Deer, turkeys, waterfowl happen throughout the city parks, along the bike trail. So drainage ways and detention areas well, we still have them. And as you know, waterfowl like the places where cattails, but where it's more of a native grass that's let to grow tall along the water's edge usually creates an undesirable location for waterfowl.
Thanks.
Other questions? Timeline on this? Oh, Councilor Antoman.
Kelby, in here too, recently it came up, tree height on boulevards. That's addressed in this also?
Yep, we didn't do any changing to the clearance heights over the sidewalks or streets.
Okay, and what is that? Could you just remind us?
It's 10 feet over the sidewalk and then 12 feet or 16 feet over the street, depending on whether the street is an arterial or collector. It's 16. Residential streets are 12.
Thank you.
So timeline then, Kelby or Kevin, on when these changes will be on our agenda?
I believe the first reading is scheduled for June 5th, and the second reading is scheduled for June 12th.
Okay, so first reading next week, Tuesday, and the second reading with public hearing on the 12th. Thank you for your work. Any other questions from council? Great, thank you very much. I'm going to take a point of personal privilege. We're going to take a 5-minute recess, and then we will tackle the next discussion on the $4 million appropriations. Okay. I'll call us back to order. Thank you. Call up David Bixler, the City Council's budget analyst, to talk with us about our continuing discussion from our work session last week on the $4 million appropriations from the 2011 CIP. David?
Okay. Finance drafted our ordinance that we'd like to bring in on June 5th. And first off, we have the highways and streets at a little over $2 million. For streets for $1.4 million, the sanitary sewer for $300,000, and then the salt dome and conveyor for $350,000. Secondly, under culture and recreation, we have $1.9 million. The library would be $500,000 of that for the RF system. The Greenway project of $1 million, just a little over $1 million, and then the zoo of $343,000. And then finally, the sales and use tax fund of $90,000 going to the Carnegie upgrade or maintenance.
Questions for Dave? Councilor Rolfing? Yes, if you look at the handout that council members have, and it's also on SIRE, is the list of items that we discussed during the working session last week. Yes, there is a memo, as according to charter and ordinance, the mayor has to write a memo, and that's what's on the front of and then there's a resolution that follows. And it is scheduled for a first reading for June 5th, which is next Tuesday. Comments, questions, changes? Councilor Staggers.
I just needed some clarification on the monies that you talked about, David. Are those additional monies, or are those monies in the CIP right now that we're speeding up to spend?
They are. I think they are all in this. They are all in the CIP.
Oh, okay. So we're just speeding up the process, huh?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll take that back. Excuse me. I misspoke. The library, or the zoo, the 343,000, that is not in the CIP.
Okay.
And clarification on the library, it's in a future CIP, but not right now. Yep, I'm
Correct.
getting a head nod from Mary Johns. It is not currently in the CIP, but it is something that was proposed after the CIP was approved. Councilor Aguilar.
Could we have Don come up and, they seem to be having a discussion. Is this in the CIP or not?
Tori Meadema, Parks and Recreation. The zoo request is part of a project, an ongoing, or not an ongoing project, but a project we are in construction with right now. The whole scope was part of a CIP project from 2010. We just couldn't afford the whole scope of the project. So this is to finish out that zoo gateway to the zoo project.
Okay, Councilor Staggers.
Yeah, so if you didn't have enough money to finish out the project, how were you going to get the money? Did you have any plans or not?
We cut the scope of the project so that it would still function and function okay. And then we'd go look later in the future to maybe do some of that stuff either in-house or through the CIP. But
Okay, thank you very much.
Michelle.
Other questions for Tori? Councilor Anderson.
Kelby, was this project funded through the CIP or through the quality of life bond that we did?
it was part of the quality of life bond.
And we couldn't, we basically went over budget then, or, because I thought this was part of that quality of life bond.
It was part of the quality of life bond. So what we did was we reduced the scope to live within our budget.
Councilor Anderson.
Different question. It's towards that River Greenway, and I don't know if you're the one to answer this. The water feature, that was an alternate plan for this phase 2, or?
Yeah, we bid the water feature and the stepped river edge as an alternate for the project, just so that we didn't come in over budget with the base bid. So we had a base bid that we could award. Unfortunately, the base bid actually came in over our budget as well.
Question from the chair, Tori. Explain alternate in terms of why do we do it that way? Is it something that we just really would like to have extra, or how is that used as a tool?
It's basically, technically, when we bid alternates, we look at a project and say the must-haves are in a base bid or in the base bid. But if we're running up against our budget, we look for alternates that we might not have to do to finish the project, or it's something that we can do at a future date. And the water feature is one of those. Stepped river edge was another one. Unfortunately, and I think we talked about this at the work session, those two things we basically have to do now, or we wouldn't be able to do it in the future. It'd be very tough to do.
Councilor Staggers.
I could understand the steps, but the water feature, we couldn't do that later?
It'd be very tough. A couple different things. First, there's a sanitary sewer connection that goes right by what's going to be the new hotel there. So that would be very difficult to do. And then also the piping for the water to get that in there. And then third, if you can do all that stuff, you're also going to be disturbing that hotel site right up against their business. So there's going to be even more restrictive access, I guess.
So just to clarify, this is going to be a water feature for kids in front of a hotel?
Correct. It also kind of serves as a point of interest. The other thing that we're trying to do along the Greenway is to bring these little nodes all along the Greenway to kind of attract people both to the Greenway and to the businesses that are adjacent to the Greenway. And this is just another one in that section.
Okay, thanks, Tori. I'm going to keep us on this topic for a moment and ask the designer, John Jacobson, to come up and talk about this for a minute. Explain the water feature. We've all seen it in the master planning, but explain how it works, what it looks like, and why it's a acceptable thing.
I'm John Jacobson with Confluence. I'm going to back up one more quick here. The idea behind the ad alternates that you asked about, usually when we develop alternates for projects, and it's this way with all city projects, maybe the budget, at least based on our estimates or the consultant's estimates, is maybe getting stretched. So what we do is we build in these ad alternates. They're all part of the original program that's trying to accomplish the overall goal for the project. But maybe we just don't think it'll fit within the budget. Sometimes based on the bidding conditions for a project, if we have 12 bidders on a project, we may get better bids than what we're expecting, and we can pick up additional program to meet the overall goal of the project. So that's the reason why we do those ad alternates. It gives us flexibility as well. Getting back to the water feature, the water feature is very much that. In the redevelopment of the Greenway, we are trying to develop different nodes along the entire corridor, which goes from Falls Park down to Faywick Park, that can be points of interest. You can see the diagram there. One of the important parts of this is it is just that. It's a feature of the Greenway. It's something aesthetic, something that while someone's visiting the Greenway, they can go and visit, and it's a point of interest. It is not an interactive play feature per se. We're not designing it as a water park, but it is interactive. If someone wants to go walk through it, put their hand in it, do any of those kind of things, it does do that, but it is not a play feature.
Councilor Staggers.
So the way we're bidding is we're trying to get the lowest bid possible, but if there is some way we can put alternatives in, we do that.
That's correct.
But why don't we go the other direction and say, hey, this is even less cost. This is even better.
Traditionally, there are such a thing as deduct alternates as well, as opposed to add alternates. Traditionally, we just don't get the value from the bidding base, i.e. the contractor has a tendency to, if it's a $5 item and it's an add alternate, it costs $5. If it's a deduct item, we might get $3 because it's already part of their contract scope. They're not as willing to negotiate, if you will. The alternates too, to give you an idea, you may be able to accomplish something for the same sort of price, but it also comes down to materials as well. So you might use stone instead of brick. You might use colored concrete instead of normal concrete. Those are all the types of alternates that we do.
But the bottom line is that with the alternatives, we are still paying more than if we didn't have them.
Yep, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
That's right. Thank you, Councilor Staggers. Councilor Anderson.
John, as we continue along this River Greenway build, the history of this now is that we've been going over bid. We've been over construction costs through this whole project.
Well, the first project was not overbid. It actually bid underneath our estimate. It was only because of some of the unforeseen existing conditions that it even go over. If you remember, during the construction of the first phase, we actually had a program in place to remove program items from the project to keep it within the budget if the additional funding wasn't appropriated for the unforeseen conditions. So actually phase 2 is the only true project that is bid over our estimated price.
Okay, what type of unforeseen things have taken us overbid on phase 2 then?
Right now there are no unforeseen conditions in the fact that we're not under construction, but why the base bid of the project was over our estimate was for a number of factors. One, I think you understand the complexity of building along the river. It's not a project that a lot of contractors want to get into, so that reduces our pool of people who are willing to bid. This particular phase of the project, there's a lot of specialty items. Even if phase 1 went from 6th to 6th Street to 8th Street. Phase 2 is just south of 8th Street. The soils are completely different in this particular section than they were in the first section. And by that I mean they can't support anything. So we have a structural system underneath the new ramp that keeps it up in the air and keeps it from moving, that there are only a few contractors in the entire region that do that kind of work, and none of them are in Sioux Falls. The particular subcontractor who did that work in the first phase and would do that work in the second phase is actually from Minneapolis. The next closest one is from Oklahoma. So, that can also add some cost to these bids, and the fact that you don't have 5 people going for a project, you may only have 1. Sometimes there's a premium associated with that. 2, there were a number of projects bidding at the same time as the Greenway was, including 2 junior high schools, the new library, and a number of road projects. In a contractor's opinion, those are all much easier projects to build because there's not as much, the risk isn't nearly as great on their part. There's a lot of unknown risk building these projects. And so because of that, we just don't get as many bids sometimes.
Okay, as we move forward with phase 2 and maybe even to phase 3, what sort of challenges do you see as we move south on the river?
Sure. Well, I think one of the other factors I should mention, Councilor Anderson, is the fact that this phase 2 was only about a $2 million project. That also impacted the amount of bids we were going to get. The first project was essentially double that, which attracts more contractors from outside of town. So I think leading into your question then, that's an important thing for us to consider, is we really need to look at the overall project budget per phase. I think doing these sorts of projects along the corridor like this, we're going to get better bids if they're larger projects, i.e. $4 million, $5 million, those types of improvements, as opposed to $1 million projects or $2 million projects. There's just more efficiency there. There's not as much waste. Also, I think, especially considering the way the event center's gone, the state of South Dakota now is really moving in this direction as well, and that's looking at CM at risk contracts, essentially construction management contracts, where we get the general contractor on board prior to even us completing the design. I think that can help us a lot in these types of projects, so I really believe that's something we should seriously consider.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anything else on the Greenway? And then we'll move on. Councilor Staggers.
Just one quick question. I know we have many phases to the Greenway, but I don't recall any estimate of a total figure to completely do the Greenway. Do we have an estimated number that we're looking at in the future?
Sure. In 2006, our original number was about $36 million, Kermit.
Oh,
now,
okay.
That,
for the whole Greenway, everything.
That's correct. But that was never an official planned out number in the CIP, just because of the way the project's been approached.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John. I appreciate you coming up.
Yep.
Councilor Aguilar.
I have a question, and I'm not sure who I should direct it to, but we had the potential of $4 million to that was left from 2011, and this adds up to $4,032,000. Where does the $32,000?
Director Turbeck, you want to help us out with that $32,000?
I'd be happy to. Thank you. Tracy Turback with the Finance Office. Before I answer that question, can I circle back to the first question that Councilor Staggers asked about which projects were in the plan or which ones maybe are not? If I can hopefully add some clarity to that. You mentioned the library. That project is not currently in the plan. There are a couple of others. The salt dome conveyor and electrical replacement for the street department is not currently in the plan. The sanitary sewer service line for the street facility, and then also the 26th Street and Grange Avenue intersection are not projects in and of themselves that are currently in the plan. So that would necessitate, as part of this process, the council to amend the plan to add those projects to it. So hopefully all the others on the list are currently in way, shape, or form in the existing plan. So now as to the $4 million, well, we've used the number of $4 million that's actually was rounded down. It was slightly more than that was remaining at the end of the year. So there are sufficient dollars to cover the $4,032,000 or whatever it is. So
Thank you.
you don't have to cut anything out of there.
Thank you. Good news. Okay, specific questions about any other items that are in the mayor's memo or in the drafted ordinance. Councilor Karski.
Yes, for Mary Johns, please. Mary, question on the library, the $500,000. I know the Oakview Library, Prairie West Library that we're building out and have a groundbreaking for next week has that system in it. Is the system that we're talking about, the $500,000, that's fully integrated between all the branches? Is that what that's meant to? And we having one standalone really doesn't make a lot of sense?
No, that would be correct. They will all be interactive. And so we'll start with the Prairie West. While that's built into the contract, the idea would be then to implement that in all the branches so that there is that consistency throughout.
Okay. And you had mentioned before at the working session of cost savings as far as employee, that type of thing. How many employees do you estimate this will free up?
Well, I have one example here that I ran on an ROI for the Ronning branch. We could reallocate 2 staff members at the Ronning branch by implementing this and enhancing the self-checks that we do.
That one branch alone. Okay, thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mrs. Johns? Thank you, Mary. Any other questions, comments about this? We are not taking action today, but just wanted to finish ironing out after the work session. It has been submitted to the clerks so that we'll be first reading on June 5th, and I assume second reading on June 12th? June 12th? Councilor Staggers.
Yes, I was just wondering if there were any other council members who thought maybe we should modify this a little bit more after asking these questions today, or?
Throw out your ideas, Councilor Staggers.
Well, I guess I'm concerned about the greenway issue, and also with the zoo having a cost overrun and rewarding a cost overrun. I don't think that's good to do. So,
okay.
But primarily the greenway with the water feature and the zoo, and maybe using that money instead for streets.
Say that again, using that money to?
For streets.
For streets,
Yes.
Thank you. Questions, comments for Councilor Staggers' additions? Okay, first reading is June 5th. Second reading then will be June 12th, and there will be a public hearing, and that will be your opportunity for amending or changing.
We couldn't do that now, maybe, just informally, just...
We certainly could if there were,
yeah,
I'm not hearing anything at this point, not seeing any. Is there anyone who'd like to jump in on this? Councilor Anderson, thank you.
I guess when you're talking about streets, Kermit, I think we all looked very hard at streets, and in that list that we were given, there was no other shovel-ready projects. And we looked at Southeastern Avenue was between 18th and 26th was on that list. And in the process of investigating if it was ready, we found that it wasn't. So there was street projects out there that I think we were ready to put in there, but I did not get any more from Mark Cotter or from Public Works saying that there were any other street projects that were ready to utilize these type of funds.
I agree that it would be good to have shovel-ready, but if we do it next year, I guess we're still doing streets, and that's a real plus for us to continue to try to get the streets done. So.
And looking at that, every year that I've been on the council now, we've had that surplus money to assign to certain projects, and I think that, you know, as Councilman Jameson works on a program on how we do utilize this money, I think that we've come up with a great list here right now, and without having any other streets, you know, this would be laying that back into the administration. At least something here, we're making those decisions with a list that we have.
Any other comments, questions from council? Councilor Intiman.
When we do have the first reading of this, is it possible then that we could also have the departments that are Since it is a reading and there's really no public input, could we have the department directors here to address exactly what those dollars are going to be used for?
Rather, to clarify, just rather than an
Exactly.
overview from, say, the finance department, you'd like each one to speak just briefly
Exactly.
to each of those points.
I would.
If staff would note that directors would be here, that would be appreciated. Thank you, Councilor Archman. Councilor Anderson.
One more thing back to Councilman Staggers. If you want to send an email to Mark Cotter, I would support that, asking him if there are other projects that he may not have given us that could be shovel-ready if we want to look at doing an amendment on the first reading.
Okay, sounds good.
Good, okay, so we'll look for that in the process. Any other comments, questions about this particular item? Mr. Bixler, any further comments for us? Thank you for organizing this. You and Mr. David both were key in keeping this organized for us. We appreciate that work. Thank you very much. Any other business to come before this body? I know that there is a land use committee. Briefly, how much time would you like? 5 minutes? His clerk is asking for 10, so at 6:05, land use committee will begin. Yes, she does, Councilor Rothling. The clerks always trump us. This meeting is adjourned.